Okay, hello, and welcome to the second lecture narration on memory. Uh, Today we're going to talk about long-term memory and also forgetting. So you'll recall this is how we ended the previous lecture and with the three-stage memory model. And we're going to be talking now about the third stage, the long-term memory stage, and how we basically what that's all about, and also how it connects up with short-term memory in a number of ways. So long-term memory is that third stage of memory that has relatively permanent storage and a virtually limited capacity, virtually limitless capacity, I should say. Um, In long-term memory, we can hold information over extremely long periods of time, perhaps permanently. There's in effect what could be called a permastore. So, studies have shown that after 50 years have gone by, uh, people can look at their high school yearbooks and recognize um, the classmates in those pictures, the classmates' pictures, even after that time and much further, to a remarkably accurate and complete degree. Um, in fact, picture memory, or this memory for these photographs, tends to be even more accurate than the recall of names. So, what's the evidence for having like two memory storage locations, short-term memory and long-term memory? Well, I think your textbook talks a bit about, and I'll expand a little bit on it here, on some physiological evidence. There's been a lot of research. You'll remember the hippocampus, which is connected in important ways to the formation of memories and the transfer of memories from short to long term. HM was a famous patient and research subject for many, many years. He was studied. When he was in his late 20s, he suffered an injury to the hippocampus that affected his hippocampus, um, which, of course, is deep in the temporal lobes and not something that's likely to be um, injured, except in very unusual circumstances. Um, so he had this injury which somehow caused this damage, these lesions to the hippocampus, and it changed him forever. In fact, what happened with HM was that after the injury to the after the damage to his hippocampus, he was unable to learn anything, really, to remember anything new. Okay, he had great memory for what had happened to him in his past, his family history, where he was from, who he was, um, all kinds of lots of autobiographical memory that was quite accurate. But he was unable to um, really learn anything new. So you could walk up to HM, introduce yourself, have a pleasant conversation with him, and then leave and come back an hour later, and he would have no idea really who you were. Um, so somehow the information that he was unable to transfer information from his short-term memory, which is working memory, his active consciousness, what he's dealing with in the moment, into anything into a long-term memory. Okay, and there have been some examples of this portrayed in film. For example, the movie Memento. There are a few others. So that people seem perfectly intact but are unable to basically remember anything new. Okay, so that's a piece of evidence that there is there are these two stores. Okay. Um, Other evidence comes from research on normal people, and some of that work is come out of the so-called serial position effect paradigm. Okay, so this is the serial position curve. Okay, and what's this all about? So basically, what people do in research like this, okay, is that they're presented a long series of words, maybe 15, 20 words, okay, one at a time, given a couple of seconds to see the word, okay. So the words are presented for 2 or 3 seconds, maybe a little longer, but not for very long. And, and immediately after the words are presented, an instruction is given to write down or even say all the words that you can remember. Usually it's people are asked to simply say the words, okay, and then it's being recorded on a tape recorder so you can go back and check, okay. And what you look at is across a number of people, the percentage of them who got a given word correct, okay, and the variable is the serial position of the word. This is the independent variable here. So was it the first word presented, the second word, all the way on to, in this case, the 15th word, okay? And so we can look at the percentage of the people that get each word as a function of the serial position correct, okay? Now what you can see here is this U-shaped curve, okay? Where if we just look at the 0-second delay, okay, which is this reddish, beigeish line, okay, you can see that there's an increased likelihood of getting the first few words correctly, okay, and also an increased likelihood of getting the last words, the last several words, remembering them correctly, okay. In the middle, the memory, the percentage getting them correct is at its lowest, okay, so we have this U-shaped curve, okay. Now, one way to describe this curve, okay, is in terms of what we call a recency effect and a primacy effect. The tendency to remember words at the end of the list, okay, is called the recency effect. The most recent words are the most likely remembered. Okay. And it's also the case that the first words remembered are also more likely to be remembered, the first words presented. That's called the primacy effect, the tendency to remember words at the beginning of the list. Okay, so we have the recency effect and we have the primacy effect. Now, the recency effect is understood if you watch what or listen to what people do when they're asked to recall the words. What usually happens is the first words they'll say will be the last words that were on the list. They'll come out with them right away. And those are thought to be the words that are still in short-term memory. Okay, you're dumping items from short-term memory out into your into your recall. Okay, the primacy effect is thought to be these are the items that were first presented. Okay, and so one was able to rehearse these better than later words. Okay, because there's no interference. Short-term memory is not filled up yet. Remember, it can only hold, 5 to 9 items, right? So these words got in first, so they were the most easily rehearsed. But then as the words, and the most rehearsed, then as the words started piling up, word after word after word, Okay, short-term memory is getting full before one can move it along to a long-term store, and so items have to be kind of pushed out. Okay, to make room for new items. And remember, short-term memory has a limited storage capacity of about 7 items, right? So these guys, these words get the most rehearsal, but after that, the words start piling up and they start falling out of short-term memory um, because they can't be attended to, they can't be rehearsed. Um, but then the last words, they're still there. Okay, remember the echoic, they're still bouncing around um, um, in your short-term memory, in your consciousness, and so when they're presented, you have a better memory for them. So that seems to support the idea of two memory stores, the long term and the short term. Now notice the blue line. Blue line is the condition in which, rather than being asked to recall the words immediately afterward, okay, after the list is presented, there's a 30-second delay. Remember, that's about as long as something lasts in short-term memory unless you're attending to and rehearsing it. Okay, when you create that delay in recall, you do nothing to the primacy effect. Okay, those words that already made it to long-term memory, but these words that are still bouncing around become less likely to be remembered because time has passed and they've also been kicked out of short-term memory by the delay. So that seems to suggest even more the short-term memory component of this dual process, this dual storage system being important. So that's the serial position curve. Now, the long-term memory has systems and subsystems, okay? And we've seen some of this already in the previous lecture. So we talked about, I mentioned declarative or explicit memory, okay? This is memory that things that we can consciously recall, okay? And to get stuff in there, it usually involves some form of conscious awareness of it, maybe some rehearsal of it, some attention to it, some deliberative kinds of processing. And in the explicit, so declarative memory, memory that you can declare, that you can consciously talk about and actually form through declaration, um, we can talk about semantic memory. These are facts and general knowledge. Uh, we know that bananas are yellow, there's 12 months in a year, spiders have 8 legs. So these are the facts and general knowledge, the meanings that we have in semantic about our world and about what we know of it. And there's episodic memory, okay? So these are memories for our personal experiences and events, things that we consciously experience. You can remember your high school graduation. You should be able to remember the birth of your first child. You remember lots of things, lots of episodes in your life. So that's the explicit part. And remember then, in contrast, the implicit memory. Okay, memory without conscious recall. These are memories that are formed implicitly. Okay, that we not even consciously, we don't consciously attempt to remember this stuff, okay, and may not even be aware that we are remembering it. So procedural memory, we saw that example in the previous lecture, okay. We have implicit memory for how to drive a car, how to brush our teeth, ride a bike, and then we have classically conditioned memories. There are conditioned responses to conditioned stimuli. They're there. We might not even know how we got them, but they're implicitly there, and conditions the stimuli that they've been conditioned to may produce the response in an automatic kind of way, suggesting that the association has been remembered. It's in long-term memory. So that's an important distinction: explicit versus implicit memory. Okay, let's talk about memory retrieval. Um, there's recall. Some people, through practice, visual strategy, or biological differences, have the ability to store and recall thousands of words or digits, reproducing them years later. Um, so, we saw what recall was in general, actually conjuring up and bringing back to consciousness something you remembered. Recognition. Um, well, we talked about the high school graduation pictures 50 years later. The average person can view 2,500 new faces and places, and later can notice with 90% accuracy which ones of many more faces and places they've seen before. Relearning, we talked about relearning that the second time through um, uh, a bunch of material or content, um, we learn it faster than the first time, suggesting that there's some memory there. Um, so the lessons from these kinds of demonstrations, okay, uh, one is that our storage and recall capacity is huge. It's virtually unlimited. Our capacity for recognition is greater than our capacity for recall, as we saw um, with the graduation pictures, and we'll probably get back to that. And relearning can highlight that memories are there even if we can't recall forming them. Okay, even if we've completely forgotten the material, at least consciously, we can't bring it back, we can't recall it. Okay, that we learned previously. When faced with the new material and asked to relearn it, we relearn it faster. Okay, even so, there are memories there, even if we can't recall forming them. So relearning time, this is what Ebbinghaus, who was like the first great memory researcher, um, working in the late 1800s. Okay, um, and so he talked about relearning. Okay, um, so he studied, often using himself as the subject, and also his students. He studied the memorization of nonsense syllables. Okay, some of which are presented there. So that depth of processing or pre-learning would not be a factor. These are completely novel. They're nonsense syllables. We can't attach meaning to them. So uh, he would put himself through this memorization task of hundreds of words. Okay, to the point where he was able to reproduce it um, perfectly. Okay, um, so the more times he rehearsed out loud on day one, okay, so that he had like perfect memory, okay, the less time he needed to relearn, memorize the same letters on day two, okay. So this is the number of times he went through the list on day one, okay. Um, so it took him, so he's got it down. He's learned it perfectly, and he's repeated it 8, 16, 24, 32, all the way up to 64 times on that first day. But he's got it down perfectly. He's got it memorized. Okay? Just the amount of rehearsal he did. So he comes back the next day, and of course he doesn't have full memory for the list anymore. He's got to relearn it. Okay, but notice the more times he rehearsed on the first day, the less time it took for him to memorize it perfectly again on the second day. Okay, so that's evidence that the rehearsal that he had learned, he had remembered more and more firmly. Okay, um, the more he had rehearsed. Okay, all right. Now when we get to recall, in particular recall, but also recognition to some extent, whether or not we remember something has a lot to do with whether or not there are appropriate retrieval cues. Okay. Now, memory, as I've written down here, involves a web of associated concepts. Okay. So the retrieval challenge is that memory is not stored as a file that can be retrieved by searching alphabetically. Okay. We don't have a library file or some sort of a, list of files that we have on our computers. Okay, so that's a challenge to retrieval. Instead, what we have is a web of associations connected by associations that are conceptual, that are contextual in terms of the things occurring within the same context, emotional kinds of connections. We see that web of associations involving emotional connections. A lot of that might be due to classical conditioning, for example, of certain responses. So here's an example of a web, of a network, okay, and all the things that these various, we take the concept, the memory of, taking a dog for a walk, okay. So here's a concept. What might it be connected to? Okay, well, it's connected to the outdoors. Okay, so that might, thinking about the outdoors might trigger this memory connected to a person, to a leash, to a dog, which are in turn connected to other other components. Okay, and other stimuli, other events, and so on. Okay, so in terms of retrieving, what if we're trying to remember something we can't? We often have to have some sort of cue, which through this kind of network, okay, brings us to remembering what we need to remember. Okay, through this associational learning and associational networks or webs of associations. So when you think of cues, think of, something, I got to this memory. You might not be conscious because something reminded me of something which was connected in my memory system in some way to this, that, and ultimately to what we end up retrieving. So a priming is a good example of retrieval as affected by activating our associations. Okay, you remember priming, okay? So priming triggers a thread of associations that bring us to a concept, just as a spider feels movement in a web and follows it to find the bug. So our minds work by having one idea trigger another, and this maintains a stream of consciousness, a flow of thought. Okay. So priming basically involves triggering, often without our awareness, a concept or an idea. Okay. So priming example, define the word bark. Now what is the definition of bark? Okay. So if we had presented this picture of a dog, okay, and then asked this question, okay, we would get, you'd probably be thinking in terms of, what a dog does, the noise it makes when it barks, right? Okay. Whereas without that prime, okay, which is, you might have been thinking in terms of the tree, okay, tree bark and things like that. Okay, so this idea, okay, affected the memory that the retrieval of memories that helped us define the word bark in a particular way, as connected to, in this case, the prime, the dog. So priming has been called invisible memory. It affects us unconsciously. In the case of tree bark versus dog bark, the path we follow in our thoughts can be channeled by priming, right? We may have biases and associations stored in memory that also influence our choices. People primed with money-related words were actually less likely to then help another person. Okay. Uh, Priming with an image of Santa Claus led kids to share more candy. People primed with a missing child poster then misinterpreted ambiguous adult-child interactions as kidnappings. Okay, so you see that um, the word, okay, the context in which the word or the word that what the words connote, okay, influence, that kind of your passage through the web, okay, in certain kinds of ways, okay, consistent with the theme or the motive or the idea of the word or the set of words that were primed. Okay, now, related to retrieval cues is the interesting phenomenon of context-dependent memory. So let's talk about context-dependent memory. So as we saw, part of the web of associations of a memory is the context. What else is going on at the time we form the memory? That's the context. We retrieve a memory more easily when in the same context as when we form the memory. Did you forget a psychology concept? Just sitting down and opening your book might bring the memory back. So here's a great example of context-dependent memory. So basically, this was a study in which, a memory study in which subjects were asked to learn lists of words. Okay, they are presented with the list, and they're asked to try to recall it. Okay. Now, the learning could have taken place either on land, as you might expect, this would be a normal place for it to happen, or in this particular study, underwater. Okay, so you've got the learning taking place either underwater or on land. Same task, it's just that the person is either in a scuba diving outfit, hooked up to various ways of learning hearing the words and trying to memorize them, or is on land doing the same thing. Then later, they are asked to try to recall as many words as they can from the previous memory, the presentation of the words. Okay, and the recall took place either under water, okay, or on land. Okay, so they now here is the amount of so in the sort of control condition where they learned on land and they remembered on land, we see this amount of recall. Okay, here's water and water. Okay, same context for learning, same context for remembering. Same context for learning, same context for remembering. Land, land, water, water. Okay, but here are the subjects' data for those who learned in the water and remembered on land, or learned on land and remembered in the water. Okay, and so they had different contexts for hearing, learning, and recalling. Okay, and as you can see, the memory is worse. Okay, so when you change the context up on people, okay, they no longer have the cues that might have been part of that context because it's a different context, and lo and behold, we get a better memory if the context is the same, and you've got some retrieval cues from the context, versus when the contexts are different. Okay, so that's context-dependent learning. So to maybe bring this home a little bit more, um, it's probably the case that you might get a couple of items right on a psych exam that you might not have if you're taking the exam at the same place where you learn the material, okay, versus a different room, different place. Because being in the same room um, where you were learning the material, by looking around the room, um, you might end up getting uh, some cues that for certain of the questions that you're unsure of, that kind of points you to the right answer. Okay, in part, that's context-dependent memory. Okay, and there's state-dependent memory. Our memories are not just linked to the external context in which we learn them. Memories can also be tied to the emotional state we were in when we formed the memory. So there's a phenomenon known as the mood congruence effect. So mood congruent memory refers to the tendency to selectively recall details that are consistent with one's current mood. Okay, so if you're more likely to remember sad things if you're in a sad mood, happy things if you're in a happy mood. Um, if uh, if you learn material while you were in a particular mood, okay, so the mood congruent memory is simply you selectively remember things consistent with whatever mood state you're in now. Okay, um, a related phenomenon is a mood context effect, where if you learn something while in one kind of mood, okay, you're more likely to have better memory for it later when you're tested if you are in the same mood, okay, than if you're in a different mood. And of course, talk about the associations in memory. So the biased memory may reinforce our current mood. So if we're more likely to remember sad things when we're in a sad mood, it makes us even sadder, right? Okay. That's an interesting side topic uh, uh, that we could get into maybe when we talk about social psych and social cognition. Memories can even be linked to physiological states, as this joke, this little cartoon indicates. I wonder if you'd mind giving me directions. I've never been sober in this part of town before. And indeed, uh, um, physiological state, it's called state-dependent learning, state-dependent memory, uh, also is subject to the congruence phenomenon. Okay, let's look at encoding and long-term memory. We can process incoming information at different levels. We've seen this when we talked about elaborative rehearsal, but we can do it through, we can encode by the physical features of something, by the rhymes or sounds, by meaning, and deeper levels of processing, particularly as we start moving from structure to through phonemic encoding, through meaning and semantic encoding, produce, which is a very deep level of processing, produce longer lasting memory codes. Okay, so give you an example from face recognition. Let's see if I have it. Whoops. Let's go up. Okay. So here's an interesting study done, actually relevant to eyewitness memory. So people are asked to look at a whole bunch of faces, let's say 40, okay? And for each one, they're told, half the participants are told, what we want you to do is to rate that face, okay? Each face you see in terms of a feature. So the question might be, does he have a long nose, okay? Is there a, does he have, a wide chin? So a specific thing having to do coding for features. Okay. Um, in another condition, the question is simply um, a personality question. Does the person look intelligent? Does the person look friendly? And they do those ratings. Okay. So after they've gone through all 40 faces, okay, um, either coding for a feature, rating a feature of the person, the face, or rating the person in terms of how the person looks in terms of a personality quality, then they're given the test. Okay, they're now presented with 80 faces, 40 of which they've seen before, 40 of which they have not. And of course, they're asked, do you recognize it? So we can look at the percentage of people who correctly recognize the faces that they saw and correctly reject the face that they did not see. And what you find is that people who were in the personality rating condition do better, okay, in terms of their recognition, accurate recognition of faces, than the people who coded the faces simply for a physical feature. Okay, it's a very reliable phenomenon, and it illustrates depth of processing. Okay, when you have to make a personality judgment, you have to take into account the whole face. You're making a kind of like a contextual judgment of the face, and yeah, it's a deeper level of processing. Okay, also processing a little bit for meaning. I mean, what does the look on that face sort of mean in terms of this personality quality, rather than just doing this structural encoding, which is a more shallow processing. Okay, so you know, if, for example, if you know, it's often been said that, well, sometimes police academies train future police officers to remember faces by picking out a salient feature of the face. Okay, well, actually, that's not a very good strategy. The better strategy is to try to decide what kind of person that is. Okay, does that person look like an honest person, a friendly person, or whatever? Okay, that will encourage deeper processing. Okay, very well established phenomenon. All right. Improving long-term memory, organization, elaborative rehearsal, retrieval cues. Okay. Um, so we saw that people are better at recognizing photos of previous high school classmates than of recalling their names. Okay. Um, so we can give an example of this. A test for recall. Can you name Santa's 9 reindeers? So go ahead, give it a try. Probably can't come up with all of them, right? Okay. But now try recognizing their names. Okay. Which ones are right? Okay. Now I think you're going to probably get a better score. You're going to say, well, Rudolph. I mean, if we're going to go, we got the original 8, and then we got Rudolph, right? And remember the song and so on and so forth. And so we would recognize, you know, probably Rudolph. Well, let me see what the right answers were. Those are them, okay? So you can determine how well you did it, okay? But probably you did a better job if you're just asked to, given the list of which ones are the names, than if you were just trying to recall them without any names involved. With recall, there are very few retrieval cues, but with recognition, okay, you know, there are more, okay, including the stimulus itself, perhaps. Okay, it's one of the reasons recognition is stronger, or it tends to be better than recall. Okay. Um, so we talked about already. We talked about Ebbinghaus. This is a forgetting curve. But one thing to keep in mind that Ebbinghaus first taught us is that most of the forgetting that occurs, this is this classic forgetting curve, occurs very quickly after you've learned something, and then it kind of tapers off. That's the classic shape of a forgetting curve. Organization, we've seen the networks in the previous, okay? So this is a repetition, but basically, so memories are organized. They're not this random list, okay? Or they're not stockpiles. They're not videotapes. They're organized, often by meaning and often by in other ways as well, okay? And what we get in bringing things out of long-term memory is we get a phenomenon known as spreading activation. Okay, so thinking about one word can make remembering closely related words easier. Okay, so the more closely these words are related to the concept red, okay, um, the more likely, okay, that this stimulus, red, I'm trying to think of things that are red, the more likely you are to, from a list that you read, for example, the more likely you are to be able to retrieve from memory, okay, the words that are closer in the semantic network than the words that are further away, okay. And here we have three sets of three clusters, okay, organization by color, organization by things that are red, some are, some aren't, and organization, again, by these were basically vehicles, okay, or things related to vehicles, and these are things that are related to other, here we got our sky, and we got our fruits, and so on and so forth. So we have all these nodes and subnodes um, through which a memory might be remembered through this spreading activation of a retrieval cue. Okay. That looks like a repetition, right? Okay. So forgetting, not always a bad thing. Wouldn't it be good to have brains that store information like a computer does so we could easily retrieve any stored item and not just the ones we rehearse? What would that feel like? Would there be any problems? Well, if we remembered everything, maybe we could not prioritize the important memories. We might have difficulty thinking abstractly and making connections if our brain was devoted to compiling isolated bits of information. The idea here is that uh, forgetting is functional. Okay, forgetting actually is something that is an important part of our makeup. If we didn't forget anything, we would probably be walking around in perpetual confusion. Okay, but what leads to forgetting? Well, we can talk about brain damage, of course, but on a more normal level, we can talk about some of these other um, kinds of determinants of forgetting, okay, which we will do, okay, and we'll do that in the context of theories of forgetting, okay. So one idea is that memories simply decay, okay. They degrade with time. They fade away, okay. They disintegrate. Another idea is that, well, no, that doesn't happen. It says everything's there, but you get this interference. Okay, new memories interfere with old memories interfere with new ones, memories interfere with each other. So there's this interference, which makes it harder and harder to get to the right pathway and make the right connection. There's too much interference. There's also encoding failure. It never got to long-term memory in the first place, so it's forgotten because it fell out of short-term memory. Retrieval failure. So the information is there, okay. I guess the interference theory would make the same argument. The information is there, but in the case of retrieval failure, you can't get to it. You don't have the right retrieval cues, okay. And then there's the idea, well, maybe some of our forgetting has to do with our wishes and desires to forget. So if we look at decay, This is what the theory sort of argues, the decay theory. Okay, unused connections and networks wither, while well-used memory traces tend to be maintained. Okay, so, and of course, with the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, we see that decay tends to level off. But it's pretty rapid to begin with if you want to consider it decay. Okay. One reason that one might argue, well, can't be decay because relearning happens so rapidly, so it must be, it must not have decayed. It must have just have been hard to get to. But what doesn't decay, what memories remain without relearning episodes going on, tends to stay relatively intact long term. Then we get to interference. Okay. So there's two kinds of interference. Okay. There's what's called proactive and retroactive. And here are the paradigms. Okay. So proactive interference, basically, let's read down here. Previously learned information impairs the retention of new information. Okay. So here's proactive interference, and here's a paradigm for studying it. So you study a list of words. Okay. Then at time 2, you study another list of words. Okay. Okay, and then you're tested on that second list. The control group never gets to study A. They're only given list B, and then they're tested for B. Which group does better in remembering B? Well, pretty reliably, it would be the control group that does better. Okay, the control group will remember more words from list B than will the experimental group. Okay, the only difference between the group is that beforehand the experimental group had studied a different list. Okay, so this learning experience interfered with memory for what was learned later. That's proactive interference. Retroactive interference is new information impairs the retention of previously learned information. And this might be how we more intuitively think about interference, okay, the retroactive sort. So both groups study list A, and then only the experimental group is given list B, okay, and then both groups are tested for A. And as you might expect, in this case, again, the control group does better, okay, because studying list B interfered with memory for list A on the part of the experimental group. Now, a very interesting thing, which sort of demonstrates the importance of any kind of similarity, be it meaning, be it phonetic or physical features, and so on, the magnitude of these interference effects, how strong the effects are, how big they are, is greater the more similar the memory items. Okay, so just to take an example from proactive interference, if you're asked to list recall a list of types of birds, okay, and then you're given another list of types of birds to remember, okay, you're going to get this proactive interference. And you're going to get even more proactive interference than, for example, if you were asked to remember a list of words of different kinds of trees, then you get the birds, then you're tested. Okay, the tree list is going to interfere less with remembering the bird list. Okay. Because it's very dissimilar. Okay, there's not much overlap. There's not competition among the retrieval cues and things like that. Okay, so the greater the similarity of the memory items, the greater the likelihood of this kind of proactive and retroactive interference. So here's a nice, interesting relationship involving sleep. In one study, students who studied right before 8 hours of sleep had better recall than those who studied before 8 hours of daily activities. Okay, so these guys, everybody learns the list, uh, or whatever the stimuli were that they had to learn. Okay, um, and one group goes to sleep. Okay, um, and another group stays awake. Okay, for 8 hours. Okay, so they're just going through all their activities. Okay, so a lot more activity is going on, a lot of events going on, which naturally is going to create more interference because of all these events that happen between what you learned and now you're being tested for it. Whereas with sleep, not too many activities, events occurring. There's some dreams and things like that, but not nearly as many events and activities as there are here. So we get more interference for the waking people, okay, than for the sleeping people, okay. So that's more evidence for the theory, the idea of retroactive interference. And that's the punchline. Okay. What words and numbers in which locations are on the front of a US 1-cent coin? This should be easy. It was in the book. Choose the correct design from among these pictures. Which of these is an actual penny, or is the design of an actual penny? It's hard, isn't it? Well, the correct answer is this one, the one in the upper left. Whoops. You see, even I forgot. It's this one, okay? In God We Trust, Liberty, 1976. I have actually forgotten that since the last time um, I I did this task. So this is, you know, we can call it encoding failure. If we got the penny image wrong, did we fail to retrieve the information? Well, in my case, yes, but for most of us, it could be that we never paid attention to the penny details and didn't select them from sensory memory to hold in working memory. We've never looked at a penny enough to process how it really looks. So that's encoding failure. It never got to long-term memory. Even if we once looked at the penny and paid attention to it, we still didn't bother rehearsing it and encoding it into long-term memory, right? So this would be a classic example of encoding failure. This is where never got there to long-term memory. Tip of the tongue. Sometimes memory itself does not decay. Instead, what decays are the associations and links that help us find our way to the stored memory. So as a result, some stored memories seem just below the surface. Oh, I know the name. Maybe it starts with a B. Just can't get to it. Okay. And basically, that's the tip of the tongue. It's right on the tip of my tongue. Okay. You have some cues that get you partway there. Okay. And the way and what you need to do, okay, and so you're thinking about it, and sometimes just thinking about it makes it even harder. You have to pull away a bit and kind of let your mind work, but eventually you may get to the cue by just thinking, oh, let's see, what wasn't this? It was this, and so on. And finally, you find the cue, and it comes off the tip of your tongue and into your memory. That would be so a failure of, if we never get there, it's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't get to it, and you never get to it, okay? That's retrieval failure, okay? We didn't have the cues. We couldn't get it out. It's on the tip of my tongue, but that's as far as it goes. Okay. Uh, so we, so this is just a review of what we've been through. Retrieval failure cues conjure up the wrong info because they're attached to many things. And then we get to motivated forgetting. Can we practice motivating forgetting? Can we choose to forget or to change our memories? Freud believed that we sometimes make an unconscious decision to bury our anxiety provoking memories and hide them from conscious awareness. He called this repression. Okay, that would be a form of motivated forgetting, that at some level we unconsciously push away the possibility of retrieving certain memories. Okay. There is some evidence for repression. Okay. It's probably not as common or as robust as Freud originally believed, but it, there, it does exist to some level. Okay. Now, new techniques of psychotherapy and medication actually might allow us to actually do the repression for us. Okay, that interventions that actually prevent us from recalling various kinds of memories. Okay, so that's an interesting twist on things. That okay, this is something that we people do unconsciously, but memories can be so disturbing that there are techniques that are being developed that will allow us to actually the medication does the repression, if you will, for us. Okay, but it's not really repression; it's a kind of erasing the memory. Okay, not allowing us to consolidate it in ways that it has that particular anxiety-provoking effect that it might be. Motivated forgetting is not common. More often, recall is full of errors. People try not to think about painful memories. If they fail to rehearse these memories, the memories can then fade. So it might not be that we can consciously keep them away once they're there. It might be that we're not thinking about them, so there's not much rehearsal going on, so that the memories eventually get pushed too far back, decay, or fade, or are behind too much interference because we didn't really rehearse them much. Okay, so the forgetting summary. Okay. So forgetting can occur at any memory stage. As we process information, we filter, alter, or lose much of it. So here's just a depiction of all the information that's coming in that's there in the sensory store. A long time since we were there. Okay, almost 2 hours ago, if we're counting the length of the narrations. So the sensory memory momentarily register amazing detail we saw. Remember Sperling studies and the idea that just basically everything gets in for a very brief moment. But you got to attend. What you attend to makes it into, if you don't attend to it, it's going to fall out. Okay. Working short-term memory, a few items are both noticed and encoded out of here, out of the sensory memory. So they make it to short-term memory. But if we don't rehearse them, so there's less in short-term memory than there potentially could have been. Okay. We don't rehearse. We don't get the stuff into long-term memory. It falls out. Doesn't get properly encoded for long-term memory. So, which we need to do. So, some information gets there because we did the proper encoding. But even in long-term storage, some items are altered or lost both through encoding, okay, or because the way they were encoding made it impossible to locate them again, which we can get down here. And if we're trying to retrieve from long-term memory, even less is going to be available depending on interference, retrieval cues, moods, motives. Some things get retrieved, some don't. Okay? So we start with a lot of information in that sensory store, and it winnows down to much less that we can remember. But what we do remember, we can often remember for a very long time, and there's a lot that we can remember cumulatively. Okay, we remember long-term memory ultimately has a sort of a limitless capacity and can be pretty permanent. So here's our forgetting summary. Forgetting can occur at any memory stage. As we process information, we filter, alter, or lose much of it. Why is our memory so full of errors? Which it indeed is. Well, next time we will consider this question. We will examine this question as we consider constructive memory. Okay, so that will be the topic of the next lecture associated with memory. Which may in fact be is likely to be a live lecture in the fall of 2016. Okay, see you later.